Welcome to today's Explainer. Now, if you think you know the story of Robinson Crusoe, the guy stranded on a beach with his parrot, prepare to look at it through an entirely different lens today. We're going to treat Daniel Defoe's famous novel not just as a simple survival adventure, but as a literal masterclass in understanding the 18th century British mercantile spirit. All right, here's our syllabus for today. We're going to cover 1. The myth of the castaway. 2. Driven by white gold. 3. The triangular trade system. 4. Crusoe the archetypal colonist. 5. The anatomy of colonization. And finally, 6. Legacy of the empire. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The myth of the castaway, shattering the illusion.
I want you to treat this exactly like an undergraduate history lecture. We are contrasting the innocent pop culture myth of a brave man surviving alone against nature with a much starker historical reality. See, when Daniel Defoe wrote this back in 1719, he wasn't just writing an adventure. He was actually celebrating the English mercantile spirit. Crusoe functions as the archetypal British colonist. That island he lands on, it's not some blank slate waiting for a hero. It's essentially a mirror reflecting the aggressive global expansion of the 18th century British Empire. Moving to Section 2. Driven by white gold, the global economics of the era. 18 pounds. That number right there is the key to an empire. Between 1700 and 1800, British sugar consumption literally skyrocketed from just 4 pounds per person to a staggering 18 pounds. People started calling sugar white gold, and the immense wealth of Britain quickly began to rely almost entirely on its production. So, what drove this? The catalyst was a massive shift in European eating habits. Suddenly, everyone was drinking tea and coffee, which created this insatiable need for sugar to sweeten those bitter drinks. But here's the catch. Sugar, alongside tobacco and cotton, was an incredibly labor-intensive crop. Plantations required a massive workforce to grow, harvest, and process these resources to feed Europe's brand-new addiction. This brings up a crucial historical question. Why did plantation owners specifically turn to enslaved African labor over other options? Well, initially, the British tried using indentured servants, working-class citizens who traded years of labor for ship passage. But horrific abuse ruined the reputation of that system, and it failed. Next, they violently targeted indigenous populations in the Americas, but tragic mortality from newly introduced European diseases combined with fierce resistance decimated those numbers. Ultimately, European powers looked to Africa for what they horrifically deemed an inexhaustible labor supply, exploiting conflicts to meet their relentless demand for unpaid labor. Which brings us to Section 3. The triangular trade system, the architecture of empire. Tracing the historical timeline shows us exactly how this built up. Initial British merchant interests in West Africa were actually focused purely on goods, things like gold, ivory, iron, and spices. But in 1562, that violently shifted when John Hawkins became the first English slave trader. The primary trade commodity shifted from spices to human beings. Fast forward to 1698, the trade was aggressively opened up to all English merchants. This completely set the stage for the world Daniel Defoe was living in and writing about in 1719. The fundamental architecture of this empire was the triangular trade. This was a brutal three-step system connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Leg 1 saw ships carry manufactured goods and weapons from Europe to Africa. Leg 2 was the Middle Passage, the forced transportation of enslaved humans across the Atlantic. And Leg 3 returned the ships to Britain, fully loaded with the massive profits of that unpaid labor, the sugar, the cotton, the tobacco. It was a perfectly designed economic loop meant to transform human suffering directly into British wealth. And we really have to confront the data of that second leg, the Middle Passage. Enslaved people were packed so tightly below deck, treated entirely as cargo to maximize the trade commodity volume. Because of the unimaginable filth, the heat, and the starvation, the voyage carried a devastating 15 to 20% mortality rate. Think about that. Those death rates were simply factored in by merchants as a standard cost of doing business. The sheer scale of this is absolutely staggering. An estimated 10 to 12 million Africans were forcibly moved to the Americas. We're talking about farmers, musicians, merchants, and parents who were completely stripped of their identities, renamed, and branded as property. And all of this was to feed Europe's sweet tooth. This is the dark economic underbelly of the era. Section 4. Crusoe the archetypal colonist, preserving the system.
Now equipped with that historical context, let's look at the text again. It's a deeply jarring reality that the classic image of Crusoe as an innocent castaway is actually factually incomplete. Early in the novel, Crusoe escapes slavery himself, but he doesn't reject the institution. Instead, he travels to Brazil and quickly becomes a wealthy sugar plantation owner. So the revealing question here is, why is he even on a ship when it wrecks? The answer, he is on a voyage to West Africa specifically to purchase enslaved people for his own plantation.
We must constantly contrast the romanticized idea of Crusoe as a desperate individual survivor battling nature with his true identity. He is what scholars call homo economics, an economic man. Even when he's stranded alone, he represents the rise of the plantation owner mindset. He views literally every single resource, every animal, and every person he eventually encounters strictly as property to be managed. Defoe's own words perfectly capture this colonial mindset. To Crusoe, the island isn't some beautiful natural sanctuary. It is a territory to be fenced in, agriculturalized, and dominated. He isn't just surviving, he's establishing a commercial empire in miniature.
Section 5, the anatomy of colonization, macro forces in a microcosm. This domination reaches its peak when Crusoe eventually saves a captive on the beach. He immediately utilizes the 4 historical pillars of colonization. First, identity erasure. He completely wipes out the man's indigenous past by renaming him Friday, effectively erasing his previous cultural and social history. Second, hierarchy. He enforces a strict master-servant dynamic that perfectly mirrors historical plantation structures, explicitly teaching Friday to call him master. Third, linguistic control. Crusoe imposes his language, teaching Friday just enough English to follow orders, not enough to have an equal conversation. And fourth, cultural assimilation. He aggressively converts Friday to Christianity, teaching him that his original beliefs are inferior. Through his own religious lens, Crusoe is asserting total physical, cultural, and spiritual control.
Finally, Section 6, Legacy of the Empire, Bridging Fiction and Fact. Bridging the fiction we read and the facts of history, we see how Europeans had to justify a practice that wildly contradicted their own religious and moral ideals. They did this by claiming biological and cultural superiority to maintain their global power. Ultimately, the Atlantic slave trade didn't just build 18th century empires and fund wealthy plantations. It manufactured deep, lasting economic disparities and racial ideologies that absolutely continue to shape the modern world. The mercantile spirit we see in Robinson Crusoe is the very same spirit that built the architecture of the British Empire. So I want to leave you with this question. If a beloved adventure story was actually a blueprint for colonization, how much of our modern media still obscures the darker histories of global power? Take some time to reflect on that, because when we pull back the curtain on our classic tales, we often find the raw data of human history staring right back at us. As we've seen today, history is never just a simple story. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time. Keep questioning what you read.